The night was cold, the kind of bone-deep chill that made every breath sting. In the small town of Willow Creek, rain poured down in heavy sheets, hammering against the cracked sidewalks and flooding the gutters. Most people had already shut their doors, the warm glow of their living rooms hidden behind drawn curtains. But out on the street, a boy at just 16 wandered with no umbrella, his worn-out sneakers soaked through. His name was Ethan. Ethan had grown used to nights like these. Since his father had passed away 2 years earlier and his mother worked double shifts at a diner, he had learned to keep himself busy and quiet. He didn't complain, though hunger often gnawed at him, and the cold kept him awake at night. He simply told himself to be strong, because someone had to be. As he hurried past the closed bakery, something caught his attention. A car parked awkwardly at the curb, its headlights still on. The engine sputtered, then went silent. Inside, a man in a suit sat gripping the steering wheel, frustration painted across his face. Ethan paused, debating. He didn't usually get involved with strangers, but something about the man's helpless expression tugged at him. The rain grew heavier, pooling around the tires. Ethan stepped closer and knocked on the fogged-up window. The man rolled it down, surprise flickering in his eyes. "Car just died," he muttered. His voice was sharp but tired. Ethan studied the vehicle, then the man. "I can try to help," he offered softly. The man raised a brow. "You? In this storm?" Ethan only nodded. Sometimes people just need someone to try. At that moment, neither of them knew that this small act, on a rainy night in a forgotten town, would set into motion a chain of events that would change both their lives forever. The suited man hesitated, glancing at the drenched teenager standing outside his car. His first instinct was to brush the boy off. Surely a kid with tattered clothes couldn't fix what roadside assistance usually handled. But something in Ethan's steady eyes made him pause. With a reluctant sigh, he unlocked the door. Ethan slid into the passenger seat, dripping water onto the leather upholstery. The warmth inside felt like heaven after the biting rain. He shivered, then quickly apologized. "Sorry about the mess. I just thought maybe I could take a look under the hood." The man studied him. His hair was neatly combed but now clinging to his forehead. His shoes were muddy, his jeans torn at the knees. Yet there was no pity in Ethan's voice, only determination. "All right, kid," the man finally said. "Give it a try. Name's Richard." "Ethan," he replied simply. He stepped back out into the storm, raising the hood while rain poured down his back. Richard stayed in the driver's seat, watching through the glass. Ethan moved with surprising confidence, fiddling with wires and checking connections. His late father had been a mechanic, and though Ethan never had formal training, he had watched him countless times, memorizing each step like a secret language. Minutes passed, thunder rumbling overhead. Ethan's fingers trembled from the cold, but he didn't stop. Finally, he called out, "Try starting it now." Richard turned the key. The engine sputtered, then roared back to life. Relief swept across his face, but when he looked up, he saw Ethan grinning faintly, rain dripping from his chin. The boy didn't ask for praise or reward. He simply closed the hood and said, "There you go." Richard opened his wallet, pulling out a crisp bill. "Here, for your trouble." Ethan shook his head. "No need. Just drive safe." That answer struck Richard harder than he expected. He watched the boy fade into the storm, carrying nothing but soaked clothes and quiet pride. Something about him lingered, an impression Richard couldn't shake, even as he drove away. He didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. The next morning, Ethan woke to the sound of his alarm, though he hadn't slept much. His tiny bedroom, barely larger than a closet, smelled faintly of damp clothes. The blanket he used was thin, patched with old fabric, but it kept him just warm enough to get by. He rubbed his eyes, listening to the faint hum of his mother leaving for her early shift at the diner. She always whispered goodbye through the cracked door, though Ethan often pretended to still be asleep so she wouldn't worry. He dressed quickly, pulling on the same jeans from last night. At school, he blended into the background. Teachers knew him as a quiet kid who never caused trouble, though they also noticed how he never brought lunch. Sometimes a classmate would offer him half a sandwich, but Ethan usually declined, embarrassed. That day, however, something strange happened. As he walked down the hallway, he spotted a black luxury car idling near the curb outside. It looked out of place in their rundown neighborhood. Students whispered, wondering who it belonged to. Ethan froze when the driver stepped out. It was Richard, the man from the storm. Richard's polished shoes splashed against puddles as he approached the entrance. Heads turned. His sharp suit and commanding presence made everyone think he was someone important. He didn't stop until he found Ethan standing by his locker, stunned into silence. "Ethan," Richard said firmly, like they were already acquainted. "We need to talk." The hallway buzzed with curiosity. Ethan stammered. Did something go wrong with the car?" Richard shook his head. "No, you fixed it better than I expected. But I can't stop thinking about you turning down money last night." His gaze softened. "That isn't something people do often." Ethan shifted uncomfortably under the stares of his classmates. "It wasn't a big deal. You just needed help." Richard studied him, almost like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Finally, he said, "Meet me after school. I want to know more about you." Ethan didn't know why, but a flicker of hope stirred inside him. Maybe, just maybe, this encounter meant something more than a rainy night's accident. All day, Ethan's mind raced. He sat through classes, barely hearing the lessons, while his classmates whispered about the suited man who had called him out by name. Some teased him, others were simply curious. Ethan, however, felt a knot of nerves in his stomach. Why would someone like Richard want to meet him? When the final bell rang, Ethan walked slowly to the parking lot. The luxury car gleamed under the weak sunlight, polished and proud among the beat-up sedans of teachers and students. Richard leaned against it, arms folded, his presence commanding enough that a few kids lingered nearby, hoping to overhear. "You came," Richard said with a faint smile. Ethan shrugged. "Didn't really think I had a choice." Richard chuckled. "Fair enough. Let's go for a drive." Ethan hesitated, then slid into the passenger seat. The car smelled faintly of leather and expensive cologne, a world far removed from his own. Richard pulled away from the school, navigating the streets with ease until they reached a quiet cafe on the edge of town. Inside, Richard ordered 2 hot chocolates. Ethan looked down at the steaming cup in front of him, surprised. He couldn't remember the last time someone had bought him something so simple yet kind. "So," Richard began, leaning back, "tell me about yourself. Why did you refuse the money?" Ethan sipped cautiously, then said, "Because you needed help. That was enough." His answer was honest, almost too plain, but it carried a weight that made Richard pause. Most people Ethan had met were quick to take what they could. Yet here was a boy with nothing, turning down the one thing he probably needed most. Richard felt a strange pull, an urge to know this kid better. After a moment of silence, Richard said, "I see potential in you, Ethan, more than you realize, and I'd like to help if you'll let me." Ethan's brow furrowed. He didn't know whether to trust a man in the sharp suit offering promises that sounded too good to be true. Still, a small spark lit in his chest, a whisper of a future brighter than the one he'd resigned himself to. Ethan stared at Richard, unsure how to respond. The offer hung in the air, heavy and strange. Nobody had ever offered him help without expecting something in return. His whole life, he had been the one trying to ease his mother's burdens, never asking for more than what they barely had. "What do you mean, help?" Ethan asked cautiously. Richard folded his hands on the table. "You've got brains, Ethan, and heart. That's rare. I run a company in the city, tech, finance, a little of everything. I see dozens of people every week, and most of them would have taken my money last night, without a second thought. But you didn't. That tells me something about your character." Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I'm just a kid. I don't know anything about companies." "That's the thing," Richard replied. "You don't have to right now. What matters is your willingness to work hard and learn. I can open doors for you, mentors, opportunities, things you'd never get in Willow Creek." Ethan's chest tightened. The thought of leaving his mother behind, even for a chance like this, felt impossible. She depended on him. Still, He couldn't ignore the flicker of possibility in Richard's words. After a long silence, Ethan said quietly, "I'll think about it." Richard nodded, not pressing further. "Good. Just remember, opportunities don't wait forever." The drive home was quiet. As the car pulled up to his small, worn-out house, Ethan felt embarrassed. The paint was chipped, the porch sagged, and weeds crowded the yard. Richard glanced at it, but said nothing, only giving Ethan a respectful nod. That night, Ethan lay awake staring at the ceiling. He imagined what Richard's world might look like. The skyscrapers, the bustling offices, the sense of possibility. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to dream bigger than survival. He didn't know it then, but his decision about Richard's offer would set his life on a path that no one in Willow Creek could have imagined. The following week, Ethan's world fell heavier. He carried Richard's offer like a secret no one else could understand. At school, the days blurred together. Homework, lectures, the same dull routine. Yet his mind kept drifting to the city skyline he had never seen. The idea of offices full of people who weren't just surviving but thriving. At home, his mother noticed his distraction. Over dinner, canned soup and day-old bread. She asked gently, "Everything okay, sweetheart?" Ethan hesitated, then told her about Richard. Not everything, just enough. How he'd helped a stranger in the rain, and how that stranger had shown up at school. How he'd been offered a chance at something bigger. His mother listened silently, her tired eyes softening. "Ethan," she said after a pause, "your father always believed you'd do something great. If someone sees that in you too, maybe you should listen." Her words sank deep. She never encouraged him to dream too much, worried it would only lead to disappointment. But tonight, there was a flicker of hope in her voice. The next day, Ethan found Richard waiting again. "Have you decided?" Richard asked, leaning casually against his car. Ethan took a deep breath. "I'll try. I don't know what I'm doing, but I'll try." A small smile touched Richard's lips. That's all I needed to hear. That weekend, Ethan traveled with Richard for the first time. The city was overwhelming. Towering buildings, endless lights, crowds that moved with purpose. Richard guided him through polished offices filled with sharp-dressed professionals. Ethan felt completely out of place, but Richard introduced him with pride. "This is Ethan," Richard said to a group of managers. "He's got more grit than most adults I know." Ethan flushed, unsure how to respond. But deep down, a spark of confidence flickered. For once, someone wasn't just seeing a poor boy from Willow Creek. They were seeing potential. It was the beginning of a new world, one that terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. The days that followed were unlike anything Ethan had known. Richard arranged small tasks for him at the company, organizing files, shadowing meetings, sitting quietly in rooms where decisions worth millions were made. At first, Ethan felt invisible, his clothes too plain, his presence awkward. But Richard kept him close, offering quiet guidance. "You don't have to understand everything now," Richard told him one evening as they left the office. "Just watch, listen, and absorb. That's how you grow." Ethan did exactly that. He studied how people carried themselves, how they spoke with confidence, how they solved problems under pressure. Slowly, he started to believe he belonged. Back home, life didn't magically change. The house was still falling apart, bills still piled up, and his mother still worked long hours. But she looked at him differently now, like she saw a light in him that had been hidden for too long. One afternoon, Richard surprised Ethan by handing him a slim envelope. Inside was a scholarship application. For a prep program in the city, Richard explained. "It could open even more doors for you, but you'll have to work harder than ever." Ethan's heart pounded. The thought of attending a program filled with kids from wealthy families terrified him. What if they laughed at his background? What if he failed? Still, that night, he filled out the forms by candlelight when the power flickered out again. His mother sat beside him, pride glowing in her tired face. "No matter what happens," she said softly, "I'm proud of you." Weeks later, Ethan received a letter. He had been accepted. Richard was the first to congratulate him, clapping a firm hand on his shoulder. "This is just the start," he said with conviction. Ethan didn't realize it then, but his journey was about to push him into challenges that would test not just his mind, but his very heart. And through it all, the memory of a rainy night and a broken car remained the unlikely spark that set everything in motion. The first weeks of the prep program were brutal. Ethan sat in classrooms filled with polished students carrying expensive laptops and designer clothes. They spoke with confidence, tossing around terms he barely understood. More than once, he thought about quitting. The whispers didn't help. Some classmates eyed his thrift store jacket and smirked, whispering about the charity case. But Ethan remembered Richard's words, watch, listen, and absorb. So he did. He stayed late in the library, filled notebooks with scribbled notes, and asked questions no one else bothered to. Slowly, his grades climbed. Teachers noticed his determination, and a few students began to respect him. Back home, his mother's pride became his fuel. She told neighbors her boy was going places, though she still came home exhausted from double shifts. Ethan carried her sacrifices with him every step of the way. Months later, the program held a final showcase. Each student had to present a project before an audience of business leaders. Ethan poured himself into it, creating a solution for affordable housing repairs, something he knew from his own crumbling home. On the day of the presentation, he stood nervously on stage, hands trembling, but as he spoke, his voice grew steady. He wasn't just sharing ideas. He was sharing his life, his struggles, and his hope for families like his. The room fell silent, captivated. When he finished, the applause was thunderous. Among the crowd, Richard stood with tears in his eyes. He had seen countless presentations, but this one hit different. This was the boy who once stood in the rain, refusing money because kindness had been enough. Now, that same boy was inspiring a room full of leaders. Ethan's project earned him a scholarship to college, fully funded. That night, as he walked out of the auditorium, Richard placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've changed my life as much as I've changed yours," he said quietly. Ethan smiled, knowing it was true, all because one rainy night he had chosen to help a stranger.